I was folding Ryan's school clothes on the living room couch when I heard the apartment door click open. My daughter Linda wasn't due home for another 2 hours. Her accounting firm always kept her late on Thursdays. But it was my 8-year-old grandson shuffling through the doorway, his backpack dragging behind him like it weighed 50 pounds. "Ryan, sweetheart, you're early," I called out, setting down the small Superman t-shirt. "Did Mrs. Thompson bring you up?" He nodded slowly, his eyes half closed. That was odd. Ryan was usually a bundle of energy after school, racing to tell me about his day, about the new dinosaur fact he'd learned, about which kid traded what at lunch. But today, he looked like he could barely keep his head up. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" I walked over and pressed my palm to his forehead. "No fever. Just sleepy, Grandma," he mumbled, dropping his backpack right there in the entryway and heading straight for the couch. He curled up where I'd just been folding laundry and closed his eyes. I stood there, watching his chest rise and fall, a strange unease creeping through me. This wasn't like him at all. Ryan had been spending his after-school hours with the Thompsons in 4B for the past 3 weeks. When Linda and I moved into this apartment building 6 months ago after her divorce, we'd been struggling. The legal fees had drained her savings, and quality childcare in the city cost more than our rent. Mrs. Deborah Thompson and her husband George had seemed like a blessing. A retired couple in their early 70s, no grandchildren of their own, offering to watch Ryan for free while Linda worked late. "We just love having a child around again," Deborah had said, her warm smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "George used to teach 3rd grade before he retired. He's wonderful with children." And Ryan had been excited about it. He'd come home those first few days chattering about Mr. Thompson's stories about being a teacher, about the old-fashioned record player they let him use, about Mrs. Thompson's homemade chocolate chip cookies that she baked fresh every afternoon. "The cookies. Ryan," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the couch. "Did you have some of Mrs. Thompson's cookies today?" "Mm-hmm," he murmured without opening his eyes. "3. They're so good, Grandma." She said I was her best taste tester. 3 cookies shouldn't make a child this drowsy." I watched him for another moment, then gently lifted his legs onto the couch and covered him with the throw blanket. He was asleep before I finished tucking it around his shoulders. I tried to shake off the worry. Maybe he'd had a hard day at school. Maybe he was coming down with something. Maybe I was just being an overprotective grandmother. But that feeling wouldn't leave me. That whisper in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. When Linda came home at 7:30, Ryan was still asleep. "Mom, is he okay?" Linda dropped her work bag and rushed to the couch, her face tight with concern. "He came home from the Thompsons like this. Just said he was sleepy." Linda felt his forehead, checked his breathing, finally relaxed a little. "Probably just tired. You know how kids are." But I knew my grandson, and this wasn't normal tired. The next day was Friday. I decided to pick Ryan up from school myself instead of letting him go to the Thompsons. When I told Deborah this, she seemed almost disappointed. "Oh, but it's chocolate chunk cookie day," she said through her apartment door when I stopped by to let her know. "Ryan loves those even more than the regular chocolate chip. Are you sure you can't bring him by? Even just for a little while?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Linda and I are taking him out for dinner tonight." That was a lie. But something in Deborah's insistence bothered me. That evening, Ryan was his normal self. Energetic, talkative, fighting bedtime like any 8-year-old should. Linda and I exchanged glances over his head as he showed us his dinosaur drawings. "See?" Linda whispered to me later. "He's fine. You worry too much." Maybe I did. Maybe I was just a paranoid old woman who'd watched too many news stories about the dangers lurking around every corner. But I'd raised Linda alone after her father passed away when she was 10. I'd learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were screaming. Monday came. Linda had a big presentation at work. Couldn't get out of it. Ryan needed to go back to the Thompsons. "Just for today," Linda pleaded. "Tomorrow I can work from home." I agreed, but I made a decision. At 3:15, I knocked on the Thompsons' door. Deborah answered, surprise flashing across her face before she smiled. "Margaret, what a lovely surprise. Ryan's just having his afternoon snack." "I thought I'd join you both," I said pleasantly. "If that's okay." "Of course! Of course!" but I noticed how quickly she glanced back into the apartment before opening the door wider. Ryan was at their dining table, a glass of milk and a plate with 2 cookies in front of him. He hadn't touched them yet. "Grandma!" He jumped up and hugged me. "Look, Mrs. Thompson made snickerdoodles today." "I see that, honey." I sat down next to him, smiling at Deborah. They looked delicious. "Please have one," Deborah offered, pushing the plate toward me. "Oh, I shouldn't. My blood sugar, you know." I patted my stomach. "But Ryan, why don't you go ahead?" I watched carefully as he picked up a cookie and took a bite. Watched Deborah watching him. Watched her smile grow as he chewed and swallowed. "Good?" she asked. "Really good!" Ryan reached for his milk. "Why don't you finish both before you drink?" Deborah suggested. "The milk is better as a chaser, don't you think?" Strange advice. But Ryan, trusting as always, nodded and took another big bite. We sat there making small talk for about 15 minutes. Deborah asked about my arthritis. I asked about her online courses. She'd mentioned before that she was taking some kind of certification program on her computer. Then I noticed Ryan's eyelids starting to droop. "Sweetie, are you tired?" I asked. He yawned. "A little." "Why don't you rest on the couch?" Deborah suggested quickly. "George is in his study. He gets cranky when people are too loud during his reading time anyway." I stood up. "Actually, I think we should head home." "Come on, Ryan." "But I haven't finished my cookies," he protested weakly, even as his head bobbed. "We'll take them with us," I said firmly, wrapping the remaining cookie and a half in a napkin before Deborah could object. "Thank you so much for having him, Deborah." She walked us to the door, and I could feel her eyes on us all the way down the hallway. Back in our apartment, I settled Ryan on the couch. He was fighting sleep, trying to tell me about his day, but losing the battle. I went to the kitchen and stared at those cookies, wrapped in the napkin on the counter. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe these were just really good cookies and Ryan was genuinely tired. But I thought about Thursday, about how dead asleep he'd been, about how insistent Deborah had been about him eating the cookies before drinking his milk. I had a friend, Patricia, who'd been a nurse for 40 years before retiring. We'd met at the community center and bonded over bridge games and shared complaints about our knees. She lived 3 blocks away. I grabbed the cookies, told Ryan I'd be right back, and practically ran to Patricia's building. She answered on the second knock, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. "What's wrong?" "I need you to look at something," I said, unwrapping the cookies. "Is there any way to tell if there's something in these? Something that would make a child sleepy?" Patricia didn't laugh at me or tell me I was being ridiculous. She took the cookies to her kitchen and broke off a small piece, examining it carefully. Then she sniffed it, touched a crumb to her tongue, and spit it out immediately. "Where did your grandson get these?" Her voice had gone cold. "The neighbor who's been watching him." "Deborah Thompson." "Why?" "I can't be certain without a proper test, but Margaret, I think there's Benadryl in these. Maybe something stronger. The aftertaste is distinctive. When you bake it into something sweet, most kids wouldn't notice." The room tilted. I gripped the counter to steady myself. "You're sure?" "Sure enough that you need to keep Ryan away from these people immediately, and you might want to call the police." I thanked her and rushed back home, my mind racing. Ryan was sleeping soundly on the couch, his breathing deep and even. Too deep, too even. Why would Deborah Thompson drug my grandson? I sat in the armchair across from him, watching him sleep, and tried to think logically. What would she gain from having a sedated child in her apartment? The obvious, horrible answers made me feel sick. But Deborah and George had never been alone with Ryan. Deborah had made a point of it, actually, always mentioning how George was reading or working on his computer in another room when Ryan was there. George. Always in another room. Always busy with something. I got up and went to my bedroom, pulling out my laptop. I didn't know much about computers, but Linda had taught me how to search for things. I typed in Deborah Thompson and George Thompson along with our city name. Nothing came up at first. Then I tried George Thompson, and teacher, and retired. The third result made my blood run cold. It was a news article from 8 years ago. George Thompson, a third-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, had been asked to resign after accusations of stealing from the school's fundraiser. The investigation had found missing cash from multiple events, but there wasn't enough evidence to press criminal charges. He'd resigned quietly. I kept searching. Found another article from 12 years ago about a Deborah Thompson, registered nurse, who'd been fired from St. Mary's Hospital for inappropriate medication practices. The article was vague, but reading between the lines, it seemed she'd been taking medication meant for patients. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type. Same city, same time period. It had to be them. But why drug Ryan? What were they doing while he was unconscious? I thought about Deborah's online courses, about George always being in his study, about how eager they'd been to watch Ryan, how free childcare had seemed too good to be true, because it was too good to be true. I waited until Linda got home, then told her everything. She didn't believe me at first. "Mom, you're being paranoid. They're a nice elderly couple who like having a kid around." "Linda, my friend identified Benadryl in those cookies, and I found articles about both of them being fired for stealing and drug-related issues." That got her attention. She looked at Ryan, still sleeping on the couch at 8 o'clock at night, and her face changed. "What do we do?" "I don't know. But we need to find out what they're really doing with him." The next morning, Linda called in sick to work. We both took Ryan to our family doctor and explained the situation. The doctor ran a tox screen. By afternoon, we had the results: antihistamines in his system, levels consistent with 50 milligrams of Benadryl. For an 8-year-old boy, that was enough to knock him out for hours. "You need to report this," our doctor said grimly. "This is child endangerment at minimum." But I had a different idea. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what the Thompsons were really up to. "Linda, trust me on this. Give me 3 days. If we call the police now, they'll just deny everything. But if we can catch them..." Linda didn't like it, but she agreed. We told Ryan he was taking a few days off from visiting the Thompsons because Grandma wanted to spend more time with him. He was disappointed about missing the cookies, but was happy enough to stay home with me. Those 3 days, I watched that apartment. I told Linda to park her car in the garage like she was going to work, but actually she came back up through the service elevator. We took turns watching through our peephole whenever we heard the Thompsons' door open. On the second day, I saw something interesting. Around 2 o'clock, when Ryan would normally be there, I heard the Thompsons' door open. I looked through our peephole and saw George Thompson leaving with a laptop bag and a backpack that looked suspiciously like it might belong to a child. He took the elevator down. 20 minutes later, he came back. The laptop bag looked the same, but the backpack was gone. I waited until I heard their door close, then I went downstairs to check the mailboxes in the lobby. Our building had package lockers, and I had a hunch. Sure enough, there was a package in one of the lockers under the name Ryan Mitchell. That was Linda's maiden name, the name on Ryan's school registration. I felt sick. I went back upstairs and told Linda, "They're using his identity," she whispered, her face pale. "While he's sedated, they're stealing his personal information." But it was worse than that. That evening, Linda checked her credit report. There, clear as day, was a credit card application in Ryan's name from 2 weeks ago, a card that had been approved for $5,000 and was already maxed out. We called the police. Detective Morrison arrived within an hour. We showed her everything: the cookies, Patricia's assessment, the tox screen results, the credit card fraud, the articles about the Thompsons' past. "We've actually been looking for a George and Deborah Thompson," Detective Morrison said, her expression grim. "They've hit 4 other families in different cities over the past 3 years. Always the same pattern: offer free childcare, gain trust, drug the children to keep them quiet, then steal the children's identities to open credit cards and take out loans. They move before anyone catches on." "But why drug the children?" Linda asked. "Why not just steal the information?" "Because they need time," the detective explained. "Time to go through the house when parents aren't home, find documents, birth certificates, social security cards. Time to fill out applications online without the child wandering around or making noise. And if the child is asleep, they don't remember anything unusual about their visit. It's calculated. It's predatory." She looked at Ryan, who was in his room playing with his dinosaurs, oblivious to all of this. "You may have just helped us catch 2 people who've ruined the financial futures of at least 7 children we know of, probably more. The next day, the police executed a search warrant on the Thompsons' apartment. I watched from our doorway as they brought out boxes of documents, computers, hard drives. They found birth certificates for 5 different children, including Ryan's. They found a notebook with a detailed log of when each child would be alone, when parents would be gone, which families had the best credit ratings. In George's study, they found Ryan's backpack. Inside were photocopies of Linda's tax returns, her bank statements, our apartment lease, anything with Ryan's information on it. They'd been going through our apartment mailbox, taking mail, photocopying it, and returning it before we noticed. Deborah had been using her nursing knowledge to calculate the exact dose of antihistamine that would sedate a child without causing obvious harm. She'd been crushing the pills and mixing them into cookie dough, making them part of her special recipe. The worst part was when they found the cameras. Tiny, hidden cameras that George had placed in our apartment during a maintenance check 3 weeks ago when he'd volunteered to let the building super in while we were out. He'd been watching us, learning our routines, figuring out where we kept important documents. Both of them were arrested. The charges included identity theft, fraud, child endangerment, unlawful surveillance, and burglary. The detective said with their prior records and the evidence against them, they were looking at serious prison time. Ryan didn't understand most of it. We told him that Mr. and Mrs. Thompson had to move away and that they'd made some bad choices. He was sad about the cookies but got over it quickly, the way children do. Linda and I spent months cleaning up the financial mess, disputing the credit card charges, freezing Ryan's credit, filing reports with every agency we could think of. The credit card company reversed the charges when they saw he was 8 years old, but the damage to his credit history took time to fix. I still think about those first few weeks sometimes, how I almost didn't trust my instincts, how I almost convinced myself I was just being a paranoid old woman, how close we came to never finding out until the damage was irreversible. Patricia told me later that she'd suspected something was off about those cookies the moment she tasted them. No grandmother bakes cookies that make children sleep, she'd said. Grandmothers bake cookies that make children hyper. It's the grandmother way. 6 months later, Detective Morrison called to tell us that the Thompsons had been convicted. George got 12 years, Deborah got 10. They'd found evidence linking them to identity theft cases involving 17 children across 5 states. Ryan's case had been the one that finally brought them down because we'd caught them in the act, with the evidence right there in their apartment. "You saved a lot of families a lot of heartache," Detective Morrison said. "Thank you for trusting your gut. I've told this story to other grandparents at the community center, to other mothers at Ryan's school, not to scare them, but to remind them that sometimes the biggest dangers come from the people who seem the most trustworthy, the friendly neighbors who are just a little too eager to help, the kind offers that seem too good to be true." Ryan is 12 now, thriving in 7th grade, obsessed with basketball instead of dinosaurs. He barely remembers the Thompsons. Sometimes he asks why we never let anyone babysit him except Aunt Rachel, Linda's sister. We tell him it's because we're overprotective, and he rolls his eyes the way preteens do. But Linda and I remember. We remember the cookies, the drowsiness, the sick feeling of discovering that people we'd trusted were systematically destroying our lives. We remember how close we came to losing everything because we wanted to believe that people were fundamentally good. I keep those news articles about the Thompsons in a folder in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that being cautious isn't the same as being paranoid, that protecting the people you love is never an overreaction, that sometimes the bad guys really do look like harmless elderly couples who just want to help. And I've never eaten another homemade cookie from anyone outside my immediate family. Some people think that's extreme. I think it's survival. Linda finished paying off the legal fees from fighting the identity theft 3 years ago. Ryan's credit is finally clean. We moved to a different building, one where we don't know the neighbors quite so well, where we keep to ourselves a little more. Maybe that makes us less friendly, less trusting, but it makes us safer. Every now and then, I'll see an elderly couple in the grocery store or the park, and I'll catch myself watching them, wondering if they're really just retirees enjoying their golden years, or if they're looking for their next target. I hate that I think that way now. I hate that the Thompsons stole more than Ryan's identity. They stole some of my ability to see the best in people. But then I look at Ryan, healthy and safe and completely unaware of how close he came to having his future ruined before he even understood what a credit score was. And I think maybe a little less trust, a little more caution, is a fair price to pay for his security. The detective told me that the families of the other children the Thompsons had victimized were in much worse situations than we were. Some had taken years to discover the identity theft. One 15-year-old couldn't get a student loan for college because his credit had been destroyed when he was 9. Another family had lost their house because someone had taken out a second mortgage using their 10-year-old daughter's social security number. We were lucky. Lucky that I'm a suspicious old woman who pays attention. Lucky that I had a friend who knew what drugged cookies tasted like. Lucky that we caught them before the damage became permanent. I still fold laundry on the couch every Thursday afternoon, but now when Ryan comes home from school, I watch him carefully. Watch his eyes, his energy level, his behavior. He complains that I ask too many questions about his day, about his teachers, about who he talks to. I let him complain. Because I'd rather be an overprotective grandmother than a grandmother who missed the signs again. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about setting up the Thompsons, about watching them and gathering evidence instead of calling the police right away. I don't. Those 3 days of surveillance gave us everything we needed for a conviction. If we'd called the police immediately based on my suspicions alone, they might have gotten away with it. Might have moved to another city, found another family, destroyed another child's future. No, I don't feel guilty. I feel like I did what any grandmother would do if they were paying attention. I protected my grandson. And in doing so, I protected a lot of other children from becoming the Thompsons' next victims. That's enough for me. Ryan just asked me if he could go to his friend Marcus's house after school tomorrow. I said yes, but I'll be picking him up. I'll walk inside when I do. I'll meet Marcus's parents if I haven't already. I'll see the inside of their home, observe their behavior, ask questions that might seem nosy. And if they offer Ryan homemade cookies, I'll politely decline on his behalf. Some people call it paranoia. I call it love.